Hi, welcome to another edition of Tactical. Today's episode is going to be all about graphics cards. Now, you might be saying to yourself, Jeff, I've seen your other videos. I like what you have to say, but I'm not quite ready to purchase an entire system used. I think I would rather build it new, but maybe buy the graphics card used, because I think that's probably the place where I can get a pretty good value. What do you think about that? Do you have anything for people like me?
Of course I do! Get your speech problem fixed, and I'll set you right up.
So we'll call this my 2016 guide on buying used graphics cards. What should you be after if you're looking to buy something new and want a used alternative with comparable quality instead? So for this video, I'm going to be talking about 4 different price tiers. If you're after like 980 Ti, Titan X, Fury X performance, this is not the video for you. I can tell you to go out and buy a dual GPU graphics card or get 2 graphics cards to get sort of comparable performance, but you're gonna have VRAM problems for one. I mean, if you're going with an SLI crossfire config, most of the cards that I would recommend are gonna have limitations, maybe 4 gigabytes of VRAM at max, and you're going to have crossfire and SLI issues, as well as power delivery issues. Cards like that are going to require a lot of juice, and you might not have it. So avoid it in general, is what I would say. If you're willing to take the leap and go for a top-tier performance card, you really should be looking to buy it new. So let's say you're looking to target the GTX 970 or R9 390 levels. If you want a new equivalent, those are the cards that you'd be going after. And there is really one obvious choice, and that is the R9 290. Or 290X if you happen to find one for the same price. Here in Canada, in Toronto, you can get them for as low as 180 bucks and as high as maybe 260, all depending on whether it's reference or non-reference, the warranty period left on the card, and which model it is in particular, but all of them are good values. I will say that the Asus models, the DirectC U2 versions, had problems with VRM cooling apparently, but the Sapphire Tri-X versions are all great. PowerColor has some fantastic versions. XFX has an amazing version that I really, really like that only has 2 fans and is a little shorter than the other versions I mentioned. All of those make great options, and you can get them all for usually 260 bucks or less. So you're talking about half price from what you would pay for a 390 or a 970. You'll get a card that's still probably under warranty and is going to perform just as well with a slight bit of overclocking. That's perfect. That's a what do you want? Whatever accent that was. So let's say you want a tier that's just lower. You want that, let's call it the 1080 Sweet Spot Plus. The R9 380X is really the card that you would be targeting if you were buying new, or the theoretical 960 Ti that was supposed to come out and be a cut down version of GM204, but I don't think will come to market because Pascal's just around the corner. If that is your target level of performance, there are lots of options. The Tonga architecture that you will find in the 380X, performance-wise, is not that much better than what you'd find in a 280X or a 7970 GHz Edition. I think it was mainly introduced to be a little bit more power efficient and have more features. And with that said, Kijiji is the way to go. You want that kind of performance level, but you're not so concerned about having the updated features, which are really very minor in my opinion. You can save more than half the price and sometimes get one for as little as a third the retail price here in Canada, which is about 300 bucks, for $100 to $150 depending on where you happen to live in this country. In the United States, they go for a bit less thanks to the exchange rate. In any event, fantastic, fantastic deal. You cannot go wrong at 1080p. I highly recommend buying them. They are preferable very slightly over the GTX 680/770, although you sometimes will find those for a little bit less. I have paid as little as $80 for a 4 gigabyte GTX 680, but typically you're going to pay about 140 to 150 bucks for them. Considering NVIDIA cards retain their value a little bit longer than AMD cards do, the fact that you can get that card for that cheap, it might actually be better than Big Tahiti depending on your market. In general though, Tahiti's the way to go. So let's say you want to go just a step lower. You're like, well, I don't know. I think the 380X is maybe a little bit too big for me. Maybe I could get something a little bit cut down, like Tonga Jr. or like Maxwell Jr. If that's your goal and you're looking to buy a GTX 960 or an R9 380, there are plenty of older options that will serve you just fine. Now, the first thing I have to say is that 4 gigabytes of VRAM with that sort of GPU is not absolutely necessary. Yes, there are instances where you will be able to apply texture packs in certain games that are a little bit better without a performance hit because of that VRAM, but generally speaking, we're talking about a very minor improvement for a lot of money. The question is, would you rather spend 250 Canadian dollars buying an R9 380, or would you rather spend $100 buying my card of choice, the Radeon 7950? You can also get the R9 280, which is usually a comparable price. Might be a little bit more because it's a tad newer and the warranty on it might be a little bit longer. You can also find GTX 670s for a comparable price. And go a step lower and get 660 Ti's, which are ever so close to the 670 in performance. And you even might be able to get away with GTX 580s for much, much less. But of course, 1.5 gigabytes of VRAM might give you a bit of a problem. Although there are 3 gigabyte versions you should look out for. Any of those choices would be fine. The one I would recommend is the Radeon 7950, which usually will net you about $150 in savings over its 380 cousin. A point of note, avoid the 760. It's overvalued in the current secondary market, and it actually isn't. Contrary to popular belief, a rebrand of the 670, it's actually closely related to the 660 Ti by comparison. The 670 was technically rebranded as the 760 Ti, which was an OEM card only. In any event, do your research, make sure you get the right one. 600 series is definitely the way to go if you must go NVIDIA, but with my experience, I have found that the AMD cards are cheaper, although not by much. Any other ones I mentioned would be fine if they're in the same price range. And by the way, the GTX 580s that I mentioned, if you want to go for Fermi, something that's significantly older, that would definitely will not be under warranty, you can get those for as little as 60 bucks. Keep in mind, the older the architecture, the higher the power consumption will be per performance. So a GTX 580 is going to require a fair bit more juice than something like a Radeon 7950. There is a limit for every graphics card, and you have to be mindful of what that limit is when you make a purchase. So let's say you want to go a step even lower than that. The kind of thing you'd buy for League of Legends or Dota 2 or something like that. And you were thinking about getting an R7 370 or a GTX 950. Well, there are plenty of used options that will get you by just fine. Now, I will note that there are 2 distinct categories here of cards. This is how I'm going to denote columns, categories for cards. In this column, we have single 6-pin connector cards that are a little bit lower power, a little bit newer architecture. The GTX 660 is about as close as you're going to get to a 950 these days. On the AMD side, in the same column, the Radeon 7850 or R9 270, or even maybe the R7 265, all fine options. Basically anything Pitcairn. Over here, if you're looking to get one with 2 6-pin connectors and a little bit higher power requirement and maybe a little bit more performance, the 7870, 270X, again, great options, 660 Ti. But more importantly, what I want to mention for this column is that, again, you can pursue older cards like the GTX 570, the Radeon 6970, also a viable older 40 nanometer option. These cards, these ones, you can get for as little as $40 or sometimes even $30 here in Canada. My favorite card that I've ever purchased used was a GTX 570 from Galaxy. It was a single fan configuration with a really beefy heatsink on it. Not a lot of airflow in the card, but the fan would had a door on it, so you could just turn up open the door and clean underneath the fan just on the fly. But anyway, 30, 40, 50 bucks for cards over on this side, and the cards over on this side, the ones that are a little bit newer, single 6-pin connector, usually in the $60 to $80 range. Any way you slice it, much better than buying your 200 Canadian dollar GTX fucking 950. If you are like bare bones kind of system builder here. Now this is really not for people who are looking to put together something largely new but get a used graphics card, because the kinds of cards I'm going to mention now really do not belong with modern hardware. They're really not that good. If you manage to get that Antec EarthWatts 500 watt power supply for 15 bucks off some guy, and you found a P5Q motherboard with a Q6700 in it and 4 gigs of RAM, the kind of graphics card you would pursue would be one of these, and they are GTX 460, 470, 480, GTX 560, 570, 580, 560 Ti. There's a whole bunch in there. Anything Fermi that was sort of in the mid to high range on release, you can get, like I said, for $40 at the high end with the GTX 580s, but all the way down at the bottom, the GTX 460s you can get for as low as 15 or 20 bucks nowadays. On the AMD side, again, Radeon 6850s, 6870s, even 6950s, all good options. Or you can even go a little older, like the 5970 is still a bit of a beast. Again, all of these cards consume a lot more power than they're worth, technically on paper, but again, if you found that Antec EarthWatts power supply that will probably give you maybe a good 6 months to a year performance before it conks out, just fucking do it. Put it in that $100 bill. Impress people with how much you can do with a little bit of money. In this performance tier, you will find cards like the R7 360 brand new, which will cost you here in Canada something like 120 to 150 bucks. And it's a pointless piece of shit to be buying. Unless you need those specific power requirements fulfilled and you don't have a power supply that can support something a little bit beefier, go for one of the used options that will save you upwards of 80% of the cost of a new card. If you want to go a step up and still buy used from the cards I mentioned, there are options, the R7 260X or even the 260. Both of those will still perform kind of okay. Or the GTX 750, if you can find one used for a reasonable price, like 50, 60 bucks, go for that. Even something like the 650, they had 2 gigabyte variants of that card that were GDDR5. And I think that's a wrap. So we're going to call this one a video. I hope you learned something. I'm going to do a new one of these at least once a year, maybe twice, and probably when new GPUs are released, because that is what tends to affect the used market the most. So I will report back on this particular subject. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed it, and I hope you subscribe. Until next time, Technical. Bye-bye.